It was almost like the Wild West of technology. Everyone could see his talent. To lose such an amazing person was just devastating.
She explains that her husband may be alive or dead. She doesn't know because she didn't check.
She was speaking in a very matter-of-fact way, very monotone. This was shocking.
She is concerned that she's losing everything.
I'm not scared.
It wasn't just sex with a stripper anymore. He was supporting someone else.
I was supposed to be there.
The question was, did she plan to do it?
I couldn't live with my heart being broken every day.
Davidson receives a phone call.
She's leaving a New Year's Eve party with her boyfriend when she gets an unexpected phone call from her mother.
Her mom's name is Adrienne Davidson. So Adrienne calls her daughter Jessica to come to the house. And she says, I will tell you when you get here, I need you to just come.
Jessica and her boyfriend rush to the Davidson home, where Adrienne lives with her husband, Ezra, and Jessica's younger brother.
When they got to the house, Adrienne was outside in the driveway waiting for them.
And she says, okay, I need you to take your brother to your grandparents' house.
She makes a second request.
Adrienne announces that she needs the boyfriend to take her somewhere. Jessica asks where. In response, Adrienne says the police station.
Confused but seeing her mom's urgency, Jessica goes inside to wake her brother.
It's kind of spooky, kind of weird. She's not sure what's happening.
Adrienne Renee Pert was born in 1962 in West Orange, New Jersey. She grew up in an upper-middle-class household with her parents and 3 siblings.
Adrienne's dad was a well-to-do dentist. She had 2 younger sisters by the same mom, and then they also had an older half-sister. For whatever reason, it seemed to be that Adrienne had somewhat of a difficult place in her family.
Adrienne's dad would question her intelligence. He would call her stupid. He would say she was sexually promiscuous. He would take a switch and spank her with things he didn't do to the other daughters.
After high school, her father sent her to Spelman College, which is an HBCU located in Atlanta, Georgia.
One of the things he did was make it really clear to her that even though he was sending her to college, his goal for her really was not so much that she get an education, but that she find a husband.
True to form, her father set up a blind date for her once she got down to Atlanta with the son of one of his college buddies. A gentleman named Ezra Davidson, who was a college student at nearby Spelman College in Atlanta.
Ezra came from Detroit, where his father was a successful OBGYN.
Ezra grew up in a very affluent household. His parents divorced at a relatively early age. He lived primarily with his mom.
There was an instant connection.
These are people who have a lot in common. They have these family backgrounds that go along with each other. They've had similar ambitions. They're both smart.
But as they got to know each other, it was what they didn't have in common that drew them closer.
He's described as very charismatic, very charming, gregarious, outgoing, pretty social. Whereas in Adrienne is described as the inverse, very to herself and a homebody.
She experiences happiness for the first time. She was deeply in love with him.
The couple dated for 2 years. Then, the happiness Adrian waited so long for disappeared in a matter of weeks.
In junior year, Adrian gets overwhelmed academically and drops out. And then soon after, Ezra breaks up with her. It was the night of a party that they had planned to have at Adrian's apartment. And even though Ezra has broken up with Adrian, he decides to still go ahead with the party, and Adrian is allowing it.
This is absolutely devastating to her. And, you know, we can all relate to being upset over a breakup, but this is, in some respects, I think, life-altering for her at the time. Adrian goes into her bedroom and takes an entire bottle of sleeping pills and slits her wrist in an attempt to kill herself over this breakup.
Her sister finds her and engages 911, takes her to the hospital. She's held there for observation.
Adrian is released the next day.
This does speak to a level of emotional dependence that is concerning. And it's concerning because it suggests that Adrian feels like she can't live without somebody else. And that's a dangerous place to be.
After the suicide attempt, Ezra comes back and cares for Adrian.
I do think that he felt on some level responsible for that, and then responsible for her.
Within a month, they were back to being a happy couple. During Ezra's senior year of college in 1984, the couple ends up getting married.
That same year, Ezra graduated magna cum laude with a degree in accounting. He easily secured a job at a top-ranked firm. A few years later, Adrian gave birth to Jessica.
She was a housewife. She was very devoted to Ezra. She moved with him for his work. They lived for a time in Austria.
They moved back to the United States, end up in California. Their son is born. Things are kind of trucking along.
Ezra decided to switch gears, making what he hoped would be a lucrative move from accounting to technology.
I met Ezra through my ex-husband who had a software company, and Ezra was an employee working in business development. He just picked it up very quickly and understood the technology and was able to work with clients to get them what they needed. He was just such a charismatic guy and vivacious and just drew people in, but he was also extremely intelligent. At that point, everyone could see his talent and his ability to work with customers and bring in new business. So that's why he was invited to join the new company as a partner.
This venture was one of the first of its kind to figure out how to put digital media on the internet.
For almost a decade, the company flourished.
In the early 2000s, it was almost like the Wild West of technology. And we reached a point in the company where we had grown significantly. We had some really strong contracts, and we decided that it was time to exit.
In September 2007, Ezra and his partners sold the company for a sizable profit. The windfall marked a new chapter for Ezra.
My ex-husband and Ezra were spending their social time together. They were going out to LA quite a bit. They were entertaining people at a higher level than prior with bottle service and spending more money because they had this newfound money, I believe. And so it was a happy time for them.
By late 2008, Jessica was in college. Adrian devoted her time to raising her son and taking care of Ezra. The entire Davidson family was enjoying Ezra's success.
He was able to put a lot of money down as a down payment on what he thought was his dream house in Pomona.
With a new home and a flush bank account, everything seemed to be going good for the family.
But the early morning hours of New Year's Day 2009 bring uncertainty. At Adrian's request, Jessica wakes her younger brother and ushers the sleepy child into her car.
Jessica is not sure what's happening, but she complies.
Jessica gets in the car with her brother and starts heading to the grandparents' house, and the boyfriend starts driving Adrian to the police station.
Eventually, Adrian arrives at an LA County Sheriff's Department substation.
Adrian walks up to the desk sergeant and, without any emotion, tells him, "I'm here to turn myself in."
Just hours into 2009, 46-year-old Adrian Davidson walks into a police substation in Los Angeles County, requesting to turn herself in. Adrian explains why.
She tells the police that she shot her husband and that he's back at their house in bed. She was speaking in a very matter-of-fact way, very monotone. This was obviously something that, was very shocking.
Certainly not every day that someone walks in and tells the desk sergeant that they just killed someone. So, for one, he's going to be taken aback by the rarity of what just happened, but also the fact that she does it in a steady state is going to be a bit off-putting, to say the least. The desk sergeant isn't going to ask any questions about the crime. They're going to get it in the hands of a detective.
Investigators step out to speak with Adrian.
Adrian explains that the shooting took place about an hour earlier in the upstairs bedroom at her home. She explains that her husband may be alive or dead. She doesn't know because she didn't check, nor did she call 911.
Given the nature of her claim, investigators dispatch patrol officers to the Davidson home, hopeful they will find Adrian's husband, Ezra, alive. Both Adrian and Jessica's boyfriend are told to stay put.
The police, not knowing all of the details, they tell him that they're going to be impounding his car, as well as taking Adrian into custody because of the confession that she's made.
Jessica's boyfriend calls her and says, you got to come get me because they're impounding my car. And Jessica's like, what is going on?
He's not sure what's going on. He explains that the police took her mother back for questioning.
Jessica rushes to the station. Meanwhile, police officers arrive at the Davidson home.
The officers find Ezra Davidson lying motionless under the covers in the master bedroom. He is dead due to a single gunshot wound to the back of his head. Adrian was telling the truth. A 9mm shell casing is found behind the bed, and the 9mm handgun itself is found in a box in the closet. A tag on the side of the box indicates that the gun was sold to Adrian Davidson on December 15th, 2008. The evidence at the crime scene supports Adrian Davidson's story, but nothing explains why.
Back at the station, investigators put that question to Adrian.
She was speaking in a very matter-of-fact way, very monotone. You maybe wouldn't expect someone to have that calm of a demeanor considering what had taken place.
Adrian doesn't offer up details as to what led to the shooting, only that she is responsible.
She shot him, she put the gun up, she cleaned up, she got dressed, she made sure that her son did not go into the room. She closed the door. She called Jessica, and she was driven to the police station so she can confess. That is totally inconsistent with what a murderer does. After a murderer commits a crime, a murderer tries to stage the scene to make it seem like they did nothing wrong. And the last place they go is they go to the police department.
She could have concocted any story she wanted to about what had happened. They'd gotten some kind of a struggle, some kind of a fight, the gun accidentally went off. She doesn't do any of that.
Adrian's 21-year-old daughter Jessica arrives. By now, she is in a full-blown panic.
As an investigator, you're going to read the situation and make some tactical decisions as to how you want the interview with Jessica to play out. Do you want to lead with the fact that he's dead and see how she reacts? Do you want to hold that back and see how she plays to see if she admits that she's aware of it or not admit to it? So in this case, it sounds like they decided to just come straight at her and explain the situation. First thing they do is break the news to her that her father is dead.
And at that point, Jessica finds out that her mom has confessed to shooting her dad, which is the last thing that Jessica was expecting. Jessica is just reeling with this.
Despite her shock, investigators hope Jessica can shed light on what transpired between her mother and father.
She does talk to the police, and she tells them about what she knows about their parents' relationship.
Jessica explains that she recently found out that her father is having an affair.
On January 1st, 2009, police in Pomona, California interviewed 21-year-old Jessica Davidson about the shooting death of her father, Ezra. Jessica explains that a few weeks earlier, her mother asked her for help with a computer.
It seems that Ezra has decided to write a book. So Adrian wants to look at the book, and she asked Jessica to help her go onto the laptop.
Jessica helped her mother find the document.
Adrian went and read a manuscript, and there was a character in the book, and the way that character was described sounded like this woman that he worked with.
The name in the book is very similar to his secretary's name. And so she digs a little bit deeper, and that's where she sees details of email exchanges that reveals to her that he has been having an affair with his secretary, who happens to also be a college student who's about 20 years old.
Jessica explained that one email in particular sent her mother into a tailspin.
She finds essentially a written contract between her husband and her husband's mistress, where her husband has agreed to pay her rent, to pay part of her tuition, and to pay her car note in exchange for sexual favors.
This person that he's involved with is 20 years old, basically a year younger than their daughter. And so for her, it's like, you know, the world is crashing down.
Adrian was very surprised, she was very shocked, she was very upset.
For detectives, the revelation offers potential insight into Adrian's actions.
As an investigator, and from a legal standpoint, you don't ever have to prove motive, but finding out what the motive is something that gets the investigators' ears to perk up, and they're gonna try and pull on that thread to see how far it goes.
Investigators continue to question Jessica. She admits that she too was upset. Her father had been far less generous when it came to her.
Jessica is like, I'm driving a junk car, and my dad isn't helping me financially. She feels disrespected. She feels unloved that her dad is choosing to put a 20-year-old girl above her as his daughter.
Jessica and Adrian discussed what to do next.
Jessica asked her, what do you want to do about this? I think maybe you should just go get a divorce. And her mom said, I'll just figure it out, I'll handle it.
A few days later, Adrian took her findings to Ezra.
According to Jessica, her mother confronted her father about the affair, and he admitted to it. He explained that he had no intention of ending the affair, and he even went so far as to give Adrian an ultimatum.
He basically tells her she is number two, she being Adrian, and the young lady is number one.
He told her to either accept that he was going to be having affairs or he would divorce her.
Adrian did not want to get a divorce because not only religiously that it was not something that she agreed with, but also her identity and her attachment to her husband was a huge deal. She didn't see herself being by herself and not with her husband.
In the following days, Jessica says her mother called her incessantly.
This is very atypical of their relationship. Her daughter Jessica describes her as somebody who was, in some respects, emotionally distant, not somebody who would talk about her problems, and yet all of a sudden her mom is talking to Jessica every day, calling her multiple times.
After several days of agonizing over the situation, Adrian decides that she doesn't want a divorce and that she's willing to allow Ezra to have his affairs.
Adrian feels like she doesn't have any options. It doesn't necessarily sit right with her, but she tries, right? She's trying to say, okay, you know what, it's fine. I still have my home. I still have my life. I still have my husband. I still have my children. This can be okay.
Jessica says that on New Year's Eve, the whole family gathered at the Davidson home for dinner.
Jessica's there with her boyfriend, and they have a delightful dinner. Everything is going very well. After dinner, Jessica and her boyfriend leave to go to a New Year's Eve party.
Jessica and her boyfriend left around 9 p.m. Several hours later, she received the call from Adrian asking her to return home. Now, Jessica is demanding to know what happened after she left.
Jessica says to the police, I am not leaving this police station until I talk to my mom. And so they allow her to go in and talk to her mom.
There's no downside from the investigator standpoint to letting this conversation take place because they know that it's going to be recorded, and even if you tell someone it's going to be recorded, once they get into the emotional exchange between a mother and a daughter about killing the father, it's a pretty good bet that something's going to slip out.
Did you plan this?
Just hours after the shooting death of businessman Ezra Davidson, his 21-year-old daughter confronts his alleged killer, her mother, Adrian Davidson. Investigators listen in.
What happened? You know what happened. What? No, I don't, Mom. I don't want to know, but what I need to know is, like, what set you off?
Up to that point, Adrian had been very calm, very matter-of-fact, but when she spoke to her daughter in the interview room, she really broke down.
I'm sorry. Oh, no. I'm not mad at you, Mom. I love your father. It just broke my heart.
But it's where the conversation goes next that really catches the attention of investigators.
I mean, is this what you meant when you told me you were going to take care of things on the first?
For the investigators, their ears are going to perk up when they get this tidbit where Adrian tells Jessica she's going to take care of everything on the first. And here we are on the first, and the husband's dead. To the police, this sure sounds like what she's saying is she meant to kill her husband on New Year's Day. But Adrian doesn't answer the question directly.
Jessica, kept asking her mother, why did you decide to do this? You should have just left him.
I got scared. Scared of what? I don't want to be there. I just love your mother so much. Mom, we would have figured a way. We would have taken care of things. I couldn't live with my heart being broken every day. It just broke my heart. I don't know.
Following the conversation, Jessica and her boyfriend are allowed to leave. However, Adrian is placed under arrest.
The investigators are left trying to figure out, do they arrest her for first-degree murder or manslaughter? And whether or not this is a premeditated crime or whether it's a crime of passion. They've got some information that suggests she's in this emotional state, but other pieces of information that are explaining that she's making very clear and calculated decisions.
Hoping to find out, investigators keep digging. They track down the gun dealer who sold Adrian the gun on December 15th. One day after she had learned that her husband was having an affair.
The gun dealer explains that Adrian told him that she was buying a weapon for self-defense.
She tells him her husband goes on business trips and she needs to feel safe.
But Adrian didn't leave with the gun.
The law in California states that there's a 10-day waiting period after you purchase the gun between when you make the purchase and when you can actually pick it up. And it's to prevent people from committing rash acts like suicide or murder.
She still goes and picks the gun up on December 29th. She comes home and she puts the gun in her closet. Doesn't tell anybody that she has the gun.
Was Adrian really looking to protect herself? Or was she planning her husband's murder? Investigators look at the couple's finances. They learn that in the 2 years since he sold his company, Ezra enjoyed a new lifestyle thanks to the hefty profit.
He goes through a period where he just wants to party and go out and have a good time. And he's celebrating, he's taking other people out to dinner, he's spending money on his employees, and it seems like Adrian is taking more and more of a backseat in their relationship.
Ezra got caught up in the excitement of having all this money, and he and my ex were going out and celebrating and drawing a lot of attention. I think in his mind, he was just enjoying his life and having fun and spending money.
By the end of 2008, Ezra's spending caught up with him.
Investigators determine that the family has fallen behind in their mortgage payments and are in risk of losing their house.
A fact investigators believe could have fueled Adrian's anger over the affair.
Yet, with all these financial difficulties, Ezra is still finding a way to make the payments of his mistress's rent.
He is spending all this money on somebody while their family was suffering. He's going to continue to do this. She's angry.
The question was, did she kill him as a result of provocation, or did she plan to do it?
Almost a month after the murder, investigators believe they have the answer.
On January 29th, 2009, Adrian is charged with first-degree murder. Now, prosecutors must hope that a jury believes that Adrian is a vengeful, premeditated murderer.
In February 2010, Adrian Davidson is on trial for fatally shooting her husband of 24 years, Ezra. She is charged with first-degree murder.
It shocked me when they refused to offer her a manslaughter. It was an unlawful killing, clearly, but it was a manslaughter.
The prosecution make their case.
They point out that Adrian went out and bought a handgun the day after she found out that her husband was cheating on her.
She had to decide, I'm going to buy a gun. She had never had a gun before. She had to research what type of gun she should get. She had to locate a gun dealer. She had to talk to the gun dealer. And she put the gun in her room where she could use it.
Adrian's attorneys present their side.
In Adrian's defense, they didn't contest that she actually committed the killing. But what they were saying is that it took place in the heat of passion, that it wasn't a premeditated murder.
Jessica takes the stand, testifying about an incident that happened when the family lived in Austria.
Jessica remembers her mother getting upset with her father after finding out that he'd been having an affair with a stripper.
And her response is to take all of his clothes, and she cuts holes in all of his business shirts, and she also cuts out his face from a lot of their family photographs.
Ezra retaliated.
The daughter said she remembers her father dragging her mother down a flight of stairs by her hair. The daughter testified to how her father was abusive verbally and how he would beat her mother. Once they moved back to the United States, the beatings, the humiliations continued. He was constantly having affairs, constantly beating her, constantly humiliating her.
The defense calls who they hope will be their star witness, Adrian Davidson. Adrian testifies about her marriage.
She just wanted someone to take care of her, to value her, to validate her. And the truth of it is that Ezra was not always unkind. There were a lot of times where Ezra was glowing and made her feel good. And so for Adrian, there was a benefit to her being the wife of Ezra and continuing. And that benefit allowed her to compartmentalize or become apathetic to the things that weren't working well.
But in light of Ezra's latest affair, her whole world felt uncertain.
It wasn't just sex with a stripper anymore. He was supporting someone else.
She is concerned that she's losing everything, everything. She's losing her emotional security, her financial security. I mean, everything that she uses to base her identity on.
She tells the jury that on the night Ezra died, she made an impassioned plea to her husband.
She asked Ezra, look, I just want to have you New Year's Eve and New Year's Day without the mistress being involved. That's all I'm asking for right now. I'm going to accept her, but it's the beginning of the year. I just want to start it off with you.
Ezra agreed.
Ezra brought dinner and champagne home with him and spent time with Jessica and her boyfriend, who were headed out later to a party with their friends.
Jessica and her boyfriend left at around 7. And then Adrian and Ezra had from what all accounts was a nice evening together.
Eventually, their young son goes to bed, and it's just the two of them.
They drank champagne, they slept together, they also watched New Year's festivities on TV. When the time came for the countdown for the new year, Adrian was excited to share that moment with Ezra.
They watched the ball drop in New York. She was very much in love with him that night and very much enjoying that night. And she asked her husband, could he stay there? Could they have not only New Year's Eve, but New Year's Day also? And he told her no. New Year's Day will be for his girlfriend.
Crestfallen, she went to bed and waited for Ezra to join her. But he never did.
She came back downstairs to see what was happening with Ezra.
She sees that he's on his phone texting his girlfriend. She's assuming that he's texting the girlfriend.
And I think that just became so symbolic for her. It is the start of a new year, and this is how it started.
Adrian says she returned to the bedroom.
She is just stewing over this, and she just has all this emotion. And he comes up, and she tries to talk to him again. I'm just asking you for a few things. You know, on the holidays, don't talk to your mistress. I mean, just reserve the holidays for our family and make sure that you're financially responsible for our family and for our children. And he just says, no, it's your problem. Deal with it on your own. I'm not making any promises to you.
He turned over, went to sleep. She was devastated. She went in the closet almost like on remote control, got the gun, was intending on shooting herself in the head.
But before she knew it, things would take a very different turn. Adrienne Davidson is on trial for the first-degree murder of her husband, Ezra. She testifies that on the night of his death, she retrieved the gun from the closet with the intention of taking her own life.
She starts thinking about the logistics of it, the details of it, like where is she going to shoot herself? She decides to kill herself in bed.
She wants him to find her laying next to him, dead.
She held the gun to her head. She put the barrel of the gun in her mouth, all while he's there sleeping soundly.
She's upset and he's sleeping like there's no care in the world, like a baby. And it's too much for her.
Before she knew what she was doing, she turned the gun on her husband and pulled the trigger.
Just instantly, she changed the gun and shot him in the head.
The defense closes, arguing that the only thing Adrienne planned was her own death.
She goes there to purchase a handgun with the intention to take her own life. And why do I say I'm very strong and clear on that? Because all of her life, at various parts, she's been suicidal. She actually attempted suicide when Ezra broke it off. What you don't have with her is a history of violence at all.
Will the jury agree?
The case goes to the jury on March 9th, 2010. It only takes the jury 3.5 hours to deliberate. They come back with a guilty verdict. They find 47-year-old Adrienne Davidson guilty of first-degree murder.
By law in California, first-degree murder carries a sentence of 25 years to life. The sentencing enhancement of using a gun in the commission of the murder also carries an additional 25 years. So the judge didn't have any ability to give a sentence, less or greater than 50 years to life.
Adrienne's incarceration leaves their son to be raised by family members.
She should have divorced him, but she chose something that was horrible and unimaginable, and it just ruined so many lives.
Cases like this showcase.
April 23rd, 2018. Toronto was shaking off the last traces of a long Canadian winter. The city had spent months trapped beneath grey skies, icy sidewalks, and winds that seemed to cut straight through coats and skin alike. But now, at last, spring had begun to arrive. Not fully, not confidently, just enough for people to feel hopeful. The sun hung over the city that Monday afternoon like a promise. Along Yonge Street in North York, one of the busiest corridors in Toronto, office workers stepped out for lunch. Students hurried between classes. Parents pushed strollers. Retirees enjoyed the warmth after months of cold. The sidewalks were crowded, alive with the ordinary rhythm of everyday life. Nobody knew that within minutes, that ordinary afternoon would become one of the darkest days in Canadian history. Nobody knew that a rented white van was already moving toward Yonge Street. Nobody knew that inside that van sat a young man whose mind had become consumed by anger, isolation, and fantasies of violence. And nobody knew that some of the people walking those sidewalks were living the final moments of their lives. There is something unsettling about mass casualty attacks. Not simply because of the violence. Not because of the death toll. But because they arrive without warning. One moment, life feels predictable. The next, everything changes. A conversation is interrupted forever. A text message is never answered. A lunch break becomes a tragedy. A loved one leaves home and never returns. For the victims of what would later become known as the Toronto van attack, April 23rd began like any other Monday. Many woke up early and followed routines they had repeated thousands of times before. Coffee brewing in kitchens. Morning news playing in the background. Children saying goodbye before school. Office workers checking emails. The tiny rituals that make up an ordinary life. The kind of moments people rarely remember because they seem guaranteed to happen again tomorrow. But tomorrow is a promise nobody truly owns. And by the end of that afternoon, families across Canada would learn that lesson in the cruelest way imaginable. At approximately 1:22 p.m., witnesses would see a white Chevrolet Express rental van climb onto a crowded sidewalk. For the next several minutes, chaos would unfold across nearly 2 kilometers of Yonge Street. People would run. Some would scream. Others would freeze in disbelief. Many would never understand what was happening until it was already upon them. The van would strike pedestrians again and again. Young. Old. Men. Women. Strangers who had never met. Lives connected only by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The attack would leave a trail of devastation stretching block after block. Bodies. Debris. Abandoned shoes. Broken eyeglasses. Personal belongings scattered across the pavement. The silent evidence of lives interrupted without warning. By the time it was over, 11 people would eventually lose their lives. 15 more would suffer injuries. An entire city would be left asking the same question. Why? Why would someone do this? Why target strangers? Why turn an ordinary spring afternoon into a scene of unimaginable horror? The answers would lead investigators into a disturbing world hidden behind computer screens. A world of resentment. A world of loneliness. A world where anger fermented into ideology. A world where some individuals convinced themselves that society had wronged them so deeply that violence became justified. But those answers would come later. On that afternoon, nobody knew any of that. People only knew that something terrible was happening. The first emergency calls began arriving almost immediately. Dispatchers heard panic, confusion, fear. Callers struggled to describe what they were witnessing. Some believed there had been a traffic accident. Others thought a driver had suffered a medical emergency. But as more calls flooded in, a horrifying realization emerged. This was not an accident. The driver appeared to be targeting people. Deliberately. Intentionally. Methodically. The distinction mattered. Because accidents are tragedies. Intentional acts of violence are something else entirely. They force society to confront a darker reality. The reality that human beings can choose to inflict suffering. The reality that destruction can be planned. The reality that evil sometimes arrives not as a monster hiding in the shadows, but as an ordinary person blending into everyday life. As sirens raced toward Yonge Street, witnesses found themselves trapped inside scenes that would haunt them for years. Some rushed forward to help. Others called loved ones with trembling hands. A few stood frozen, unable to process what their eyes were seeing. One moment they had been thinking about work deadlines, dinner plans, errands, and appointments. The next they were confronting mortality. It happened that quickly. The human mind often struggles to understand sudden violence. People expect danger to announce itself. They expect warning signs. A loud argument. A visible weapon. A threat. But many acts of mass violence arrive without any dramatic introduction. Normality exists right up until the moment it disappears. For countless witnesses that afternoon, that disappearance happened in seconds. The city they thought they knew suddenly felt unfamiliar. Unsafe. Fragile. Even those who were nowhere near Yonge Street would later remember exactly where they were when the news broke. Televisions interrupted programming. Phone alerts spread rapidly. Social media exploded with confusion and rumors. Parents called children. Children called parents. Friends checked on friends. Canadians across the country watched events unfold with growing horror. The images emerging from Toronto seemed impossible. This was Canada, a nation often associated with safety, stability, peace. Yet there on television screens was a scene resembling something from a nightmare. Police vehicles, ambulances, road closures, crowds gathered behind barriers, investigators examining evidence. And somewhere within that unfolding crisis was a question that nobody could yet answer. Who was responsible? The answer would shock many. Not because the attacker was a criminal mastermind. Not because he belonged to an organized terrorist network. Not because he had spent years hiding from authorities. The answer was unsettling precisely because of how ordinary he appeared. 25-year-old Alek Minassian did not fit the image many people imagined when they thought of mass killers. There was no dramatic criminal history. No notorious reputation. No secret double life worthy of a Hollywood thriller. Instead, investigators would discover a young man marked by social isolation, personal frustrations, and a deepening relationship with toxic online communities. Communities where bitterness became identity. Where grievance became purpose. Where violence could be celebrated rather than condemned. Yet even that explanation would never fully satisfy everyone. Because understanding motive is not the same as understanding choice. Millions of people experience loneliness. Millions face rejection. Millions struggle with social connection. Almost none choose violence. That uncomfortable truth would remain at the center of the case. The deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the story became. But before the investigation, before the arrest, before the courtroom battles, before the psychological evaluations, there was simply a city in crisis. A city trying desperately to comprehend what had happened. As emergency crews worked across the attack zone, countless acts of courage unfolded. Strangers rushed toward danger to help victims. Medical professionals abandoned routines and responded without hesitation. Bystanders comforted the injured. Some removed jackets to stop bleeding. Others held hands. Others offered words of reassurance despite not knowing whether those reassurances were true. In moments of catastrophe, humanity often reveals two extremes. Its capacity for cruelty. And its capacity for compassion. The Toronto van attack would expose both. One individual chose to spread terror. Hundreds of others chose to help. And while history often remembers the name of the perpetrator, the deeper story belongs to the people whose lives were forever changed. The victims. The survivors. The witnesses. The families. The first responders. The ordinary citizens who found themselves caught inside extraordinary circumstances. Because long after headlines fade, they are the ones who continue carrying the weight of what happened. For some, that weight would last years. For others, a lifetime. Trauma does not obey calendars. It does not disappear because a news cycle ends. It lingers in memories. In nightmares. In sudden flashes of fear triggered by sounds, locations, or dates. The attack lasted only minutes. Its consequences would endure far longer. As afternoon turned into evening on April 23, investigators began securing evidence. Witnesses were interviewed. Roads remained closed. Families desperately searched for information. Hospitals worked to treat the injured. And across Toronto, an unsettling silence settled over conversations. People were struggling to understand, struggling to process, struggling to find meaning where there seemed to be none. The city had awakened expecting an ordinary Monday. It ended the day mourning lives that had been stolen without warning. And somewhere within the growing darkness of that evening, a question remained unanswered. How had a young man sitting alone behind the wheel of a rented van reached the point where he could drive into a crowd of strangers? To answer that question, we have to travel backward. Back before the headlines. Back before the flashing emergency lights. Back before Yonge Street became synonymous with tragedy. We have to examine the city, the victims, the families, and the young man whose path toward violence began long before anyone noticed the warning signs. Because the story of the Toronto van attack did not begin on April 23, 2018. It began years earlier. And understanding that journey means stepping into a world where loneliness, obsession, resentment, and a desperate desire for significance slowly converged into one catastrophic afternoon that changed Canada forever. Before the tragedy became a headline, before investigators pieced together timelines and evidence, before television crews gathered behind police tape, there was simply Toronto. A city of glass towers and crowded sidewalks. A city where millions of people moved through their days believing that tomorrow would arrive much like today. To understand the Toronto van attack, it is necessary to understand the place where it happened. Because crimes of this magnitude do not occur in a vacuum. They unfold within communities, within neighborhoods, within the ordinary lives of people who never imagine that history is about to intersect with their own. In the spring of 2018, Toronto was the largest city in Canada and one of the most diverse cities in the world. More than half of its residents had been born outside the country. Languages from every corner of the globe echoed through its streets. Cultures mixed naturally. Restaurants stood side by side representing nations separated by oceans. People from different backgrounds shared buses, office buildings, schools, and apartment complexes. For many, Toronto represented opportunity. A place where careers could be built. Families could grow. Dreams could take shape. The city carried an energy that felt both ambitious and welcoming. Every morning, trains poured thousands of commuters into the urban core. Coffee shops filled with conversations. Sidewalks became rivers of movement. Construction cranes stretched above the skyline, symbols of a city that seemed to be constantly expanding. Yet beneath that image of prosperity existed the quieter reality of modern urban life. Millions of people living close together while often feeling profoundly alone. It is one of the strange contradictions of large cities. You can stand surrounded by thousands of people and still feel invisible. You can ride crowded trains every day and never speak to anyone. You can spend years sharing space with strangers without ever truly connecting. For most people, that loneliness remains manageable. For others, it becomes something darker. Something dangerous. But that part of the story was still hidden. The city itself knew nothing of what was approaching. On the northern stretch of Yonge Street, life followed its normal rhythm. Yonge Street occupies a unique place in Toronto's identity. 4 generations it has served as one of the city's central arteries, connecting neighborhoods, businesses, schools, and communities. It is more than a road. It is a thread running through the city's history. In North York, where the attack would occur, Yonge Street looked different from the bustling downtown core. The towering financial district gradually gave way to residential towers, office complexes, restaurants, retail stores, and community spaces. People walked constantly. Workers heading to meetings. Students carrying backpacks. Parents pushing strollers. Seniors enjoying afternoon walks. The sidewalks remained busy throughout the day. That was precisely what made the area attractive to someone seeking maximum destruction. But nobody knew that yet. On the morning of April 23rd, the weather offered a sense of relief after a particularly harsh winter. Canadians often speak about winter not simply as a season but as an experience. Months of snow. Months of darkness. Months of freezing temperatures. When spring finally arrives, even partially, the entire mood of a city seems to change. People spend more time outside. Faces appear more relaxed. Parks begin filling again. The simple act of walking outdoors becomes enjoyable. That Monday carried some of that feeling. Not perfect warmth. Not summer. But enough sunshine to encourage people onto the sidewalks. Enough to create optimism. The kind of ordinary optimism that exists before disaster. At approximately lunchtime, Yonge Street reflected that atmosphere perfectly. Cars moved steadily through traffic. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Businesses welcomed customers. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested that within hours, the location would become synonymous with tragedy. Several kilometers away, another story was unfolding. A quieter story. One that had developed over years. A story centered on a young man named Alec Minassian. At first glance, there was little about him that seemed remarkable. No notorious criminal record. No history that immediately suggested future mass violence. No public image that attracted attention. He was, in many ways, the kind of person most people would never notice. And perhaps that was part of the problem. Born in 1992, Minassian grew up in a suburban environment north of Toronto. His childhood was not defined by dramatic criminal influences or chaotic instability. Instead, many accounts described him as socially awkward, isolated, and struggling to connect with peers. As a child, he reportedly faced developmental challenges. Social interactions often appeared difficult. Relationships did not come easily. Communication could be awkward. The subtle rules that guide everyday human connection often seemed elusive. For some individuals, these challenges become obstacles that can be overcome with support, patience, and personal growth. For others, they become sources of frustration that deepen over time. As the years passed, Minassian increasingly appeared to drift toward the margins of social life. Friendships were limited. Romantic relationships were virtually non-existent. Many people who later examined his history described a pattern of isolation. He often seemed disconnected from the social experiences that many of his peers took for granted. School dances. Dating. Close friendships. Shared adventures. The ordinary milestones that help people develop a sense of belonging. Isolation alone does not create violence. That distinction is important. Millions of people experience loneliness without harming anyone. But isolation can become fertile ground for resentment when combined with certain beliefs. And in the age of the internet, those beliefs can find reinforcement in unexpected places. Throughout human history, lonely individuals often struggled in private. Today, loneliness can gather online. Communities can form around shared grievances. Anger can find audiences. Resentment can find validation. And ideas that once remained isolated can spread rapidly among like-minded strangers. Long before April 23, 2018, parts of the internet had become home to a growing subculture known as the incel movement. The term originated as a shorthand for involuntary celibacy. At its most basic level, it described individuals who desired romantic relationships but felt unable to obtain them. Yet over time, certain corners of that community evolved into something far darker. Frustration became ideology. Personal disappointment became collective anger. Women were blamed. Society was blamed. Success was viewed as evidence of injustice. Some participants spent years reinforcing one another's resentment. The internet transformed private bitterness into group identity. Inside those spaces, narratives developed. Narratives claiming that certain people were entitled to affection. Narratives portraying rejection as oppression. Narratives suggesting that violence represented a form of revenge. Most people exposed to such ideas reject them. Some do not. And investigators would eventually discover that Minassian had become fascinated by these communities. But on the surface, his life still appeared largely unremarkable. He attended school. He lived with family. He attempted higher education. At one point, he briefly enrolled in military training but was unable to complete the program. The experience reportedly ended quickly. Another setback. Another disappointment. Another reminder that life was not unfolding according to his expectations. Setbacks are part of life. Yet some individuals develop resilience through adversity while others develop resentment. The difference often shapes the paths they eventually follow. By 2018, Minassian was 25 years old. An age when many people are establishing careers, relationships, and independent lives. For him, however, many of those milestones remained absent. The gap between his expectations and reality appeared to be widening. And somewhere behind the scenes, troubling ideas continued to take root. Meanwhile, Toronto moved through another ordinary spring. The city knew nothing about the growing storm hidden inside one resident's mind. Neighbors continued mowing lawns. Students prepared for exams. Office workers worried about deadlines. Parents attended school events. Life moved forward. It always does. That is one of the reasons tragedies feel so shocking. The future appears stable right up until the moment it isn't. If someone had stood on Yonge Street that morning and pointed toward the busy sidewalks, nobody would have predicted what was coming. People would have laughed at the suggestion. The scene looked too normal. Too familiar. Too safe. Yet history often disguises itself as ordinary moments before revealing its true significance. A woman checking messages at a crosswalk. A man carrying groceries. A student heading toward class. A retiree enjoying the weather. Future victims moving through routines they had followed countless times before. Their stories remained unwritten. Their futures still appeared intact. Plans for the evening existed. Plans for the following week existed. Vacations. Birthdays. Family gatherings. Work commitments. Tiny details that seemed certain to happen. The future always feels guaranteed until the moment it isn't. Across the city, emergency services carried out routine duties. Police officers completed paperwork. Paramedics responded to medical calls. Dispatchers answered phones. Everything appeared normal. No alarms. No warnings. No indication that one of the largest mass casualty events in modern Canadian history was only hours away. This sense of normality is crucial to understanding the emotional impact of what happened later. People often imagine that disasters arrive surrounded by warning signs. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they emerge directly from the ordinary. A regular weekday. A familiar street. An everyday vehicle. A person nobody considered particularly dangerous. And that combination can be uniquely terrifying because it challenges assumptions about safety. The Toronto van attack would eventually force Canadians to confront difficult questions. Questions about radicalization. Questions about online extremism. Questions about loneliness and alienation. Questions about how seemingly ordinary individuals can become capable of extraordinary violence. But those questions belonged to the future. On the morning of April 23, they remained unanswered. The city existed in a state of innocence. Not innocence in the sense of perfection. Every city faces crime. Every community faces challenges. But innocence in the sense that people still believed this would be an ordinary Monday. By noon, sidewalks grew busier. Lunch crowds emerged. Businesses welcomed customers. Traffic moved steadily through North York. The spring sunlight reflected from office windows. Conversations drifted through the air. The sounds of urban life blended together into a familiar soundtrack. Nothing felt extraordinary. Nothing felt historic. Nothing felt dangerous. And somewhere within that same city, a 25-year-old man was moving toward a decision that would alter countless lives forever. The distance between ordinary life and catastrophe is often far smaller than people realize. Sometimes it is measured in years of resentment. Sometimes in months of planning. Sometimes in a single moment when thought becomes action. The people walking along Yonge Street could not see any of that. They only saw another afternoon. Another day. Another chapter in lives they expected to continue. Yet as clocks ticked toward 1:22 p.m., the stage had already been set. The city. The street. The future victims. The future perpetrator. All moving steadily toward the same point in time. A point from which there would be no return. And when that moment finally arrived, Toronto would discover how quickly an ordinary day can become a tragedy remembered for generations. When people remember mass casualty events, attention often gravitates toward the perpetrator. The photographs. The motives. The investigation. The courtroom proceedings. The endless attempt to understand why someone chose violence. Yet the true heart of every tragedy lies elsewhere. It lies in the people whose lives were interrupted. The people who woke up expecting an ordinary day and never had the opportunity to finish it. The people whose names rarely become as recognizable as the person who harmed them. The Toronto van attack was not the story of one man. It was the story of dozens of lives that intersected on a spring afternoon. Lives built over decades. Lives filled with hopes, responsibilities, relationships, and routines. Lives that mattered long before they became victims. To understand the depth of what happened on April 23, 2018, it is necessary to step away from the attacker for a moment and focus on those whose absence would leave empty chairs at dinner tables, unanswered phone calls, unfinished plans, and families forever changed. Each victim carried an entire world within them. A world invisible to strangers passing on the sidewalk. A world of memories, dreams, friendships, fears, accomplishments, and love. From a distance, a pedestrian appears as little more than a figure moving through a crowd. But every pedestrian is a story. Every face contains decades of experiences. Every life is larger than anyone else can fully see. That afternoon, Yonge Street was filled with those unseen stories. Some belonged to young people standing at the beginning of adulthood. Others belonged to seniors who had spent decades building families and communities. Some were professionals heading to work. Some were students. Some were visitors. Some were simply enjoying the improving weather after a long Canadian winter. None of them knew they were becoming part of history. One of those individuals was a young woman whose future seemed wide open. She had ambitions. Goals. People who cared deeply about her. Friends who expected to see her again. Family members who assumed there would be countless more conversations ahead. The details of everyday life often appear insignificant until they disappear. A planned birthday celebration. An upcoming vacation. A text message waiting to be answered. A favorite television show. An inside joke shared among friends. These tiny details create the texture of a human life. When a life ends suddenly, those details become precious. Loved ones cling to them. The memory of a laugh. The sound of a voice. The way someone entered a room. The stories told at family gatherings. The habits that once seemed ordinary become treasures. Elsewhere on Yonge Street walked a mother. Like countless mothers around the world, much of her life revolved around caring for others. Her responsibilities rarely paused. Families often depend on quiet sacrifices that go unnoticed. Meals prepared. Appointments remembered. Concerns carried privately. Acts of love repeated day after day without recognition. These forms of devotion rarely appear in headlines. Yet when they vanish, entire families feel the absence immediately. For those left behind, grief often arrives not only through major milestones but through ordinary moments. An empty seat at breakfast. A holiday gathering missing one voice. A phone number that remains saved but will never answer again. These are the wounds that linger. Another victim spent years contributing to the community around her. Friends described kindness. Reliability. The sort of person people trusted. The sort of person who made others feel welcome. Such qualities rarely attract public attention. They do not generate fame. They do not create headlines. But they shape lives. Communities depend on people like this far more than most realize. When violence removes them, the loss extends beyond immediate family. Co-workers feel it. Neighbors feel it. Friends feel it. Entire social circles suddenly find themselves altered. There was also a grandmother among those whose lives would be taken. A woman who had witnessed decades of change. A woman whose life story stretched far beyond that spring afternoon. Grandparents occupy a unique place within families. They carry history. They preserve stories. They connect generations. For grandchildren, they often seem permanent. A constant presence. A source of wisdom and comfort. The sudden loss of such a figure creates a void difficult to describe. Not simply because a person is gone, but because an entire library of memories disappears with them. The attack would also claim the life of a man whose family had traveled through hardships and triumphs together. Like many immigrants who helped build modern Toronto, he represented perseverance. The city's identity has long been shaped by people arriving from elsewhere in search of opportunity. They bring traditions, languages, dreams. They work long hours. They build businesses. They raise children. They contribute to neighborhoods and communities. Their stories become woven into the city's fabric. The loss of even one such life reverberates far beyond a single family. Every victim represented years of effort. Years of learning. Years of relationships. Years spent becoming who they were. And all of it existed before the world learned their names. One of the most heartbreaking realities of mass violence is how quickly society reduces individuals to statistics. 10 dead. 11 dead. 15 injured. Numbers are useful for understanding scale. But numbers can never capture humanity. A statistic cannot describe a father's sense of humor. A daughter's dreams. A grandmother's embrace. A friend's loyalty. A spouse's devotion. Numbers measure loss. They do not explain it. The people walking along Yonge Street that afternoon were not numbers. They were human beings living ordinary lives. Many had responsibilities waiting for them. Meetings. Appointments. Family dinners. Errands. Schoolwork. Plans for the evening. Some likely worried about minor inconveniences. Traffic. Deadlines. Bills. The countless small frustrations that occupy everyday thought. None of those concerns mattered minutes later. Violence has a brutal way of reorganizing priorities. What once seemed important suddenly becomes irrelevant. And what seemed guaranteed suddenly becomes fragile. For the survivors, that realization arrived in an instant. Many would later describe ordinary moments before the attack with astonishing clarity. The weather. The direction they were walking. A conversation they had just finished. A store they had passed. The human brain often preserves details surrounding trauma with unusual precision. As if desperately attempting to understand the moment when life divided into before and after. For families of the victims, there would forever be a before and an after. Before April 23rd. After April 23rd. Before the phone call. After the phone call. Before uncertainty. After certainty. No parent imagines receiving news that their child has been killed during a routine afternoon walk. No spouse expects a normal workday to end with police officers at the door. No child expects a parent to vanish from the future. Yet these impossible realities became real for multiple families that day. Across Toronto, ordinary routines gradually transformed into concern. Concern transformed into fear. Fear transformed into devastation. Some family members first learned something was wrong when calls went unanswered. Others saw breaking news reports. Some began contacting hospitals. Others waited desperately for information. The waiting itself became a form of torment. Human beings crave certainty. Even painful certainty. The unknown often feels worse. Hours stretched endlessly. Questions multiplied. Hope battled against dread. And eventually, many families received answers they never wanted. The attack also left behind survivors whose lives would never be the same. Physical injuries represented only part of the damage. Trauma often extends far beyond visible wounds. Many survivors would carry emotional scars for years. Some struggled with anxiety. Others experienced recurring nightmares. Many wrestled with guilt simply because they survived when others did not. Survivor's guilt is one of the cruelest consequences of tragedy. Individuals begin asking impossible questions. Why did I live? Why was I spared? Could I have done something differently? The questions rarely produce satisfying answers. Yet they persist. Again and again. Long after headlines disappear. Long after public attention fades. Long after the world moves on. The survivors of Yonge Street became unwilling participants in a story they never chose. Their lives divided into two chapters. Everything before the attack. Everything after. Some would spend years rebuilding confidence. Years relearning how to feel safe. Years processing memories that returned unexpectedly. A crowded sidewalk. The sound of traffic. A passing vehicle. Ordinary sights suddenly carried new meanings. Trauma changes perception. Places once associated with routine become associated with memory. The attack site itself eventually returned to normal appearance. Traffic resumed. Pedestrians returned. Businesses reopened. From a distance, life appeared to continue. But for many people, the location would never feel entirely ordinary again. Certain places absorb history. Even when physical evidence disappears, memory remains. For the families of victims, Yonge Street became more than a location. It became the place where futures ended. The place where plans vanished. The place where loved ones took final breaths. The place forever connected to grief. Yet amid the sorrow, another truth emerged. The victims were remembered not because of how they died, but because of how they lived. Friends shared stories. Families shared photographs. Co-workers shared memories. Communities gathered. People spoke about kindness, generosity, dedication, humor, compassion. The qualities that truly define a life. Violence may end a life, but it cannot erase the impact that life had on others. The attack created loss. But it also revealed how deeply these individuals were loved. Every tribute told a story. Every memorial carried meaning. Every flower placed at the scene represented someone remembering. Someone grieving. Someone refusing to allow a loved one to become merely another statistic. As the city mourned, thousands of residents found themselves reflecting on vulnerability. The victims could have been anyone. A co-worker. A friend. A family member. The randomness of the attack amplified its emotional impact. There was no personal connection between the perpetrator and most of those harmed. No specific grievance. No individual conflict. The victims were targeted simply because they happened to be present. That randomness disturbed people profoundly. It challenged assumptions about control, about predictability, about safety. Yet even within that uncertainty, communities responded with compassion. Memorials appeared. Candles flickered. Messages accumulated. Strangers comforted strangers. The city mourned collectively. Because the victims belonged not only to their families but also to Toronto itself. They were residents, neighbors, co-workers, citizens, people whose lives contributed to the character of the community around them. And while the attack lasted only minutes, the stories of those affected extended far beyond those moments. Each victim had a childhood, a family, a history, a collection of dreams and disappointments that shaped who they became. Their lives cannot be summarized by the circumstances of their deaths. Nor should they be. The true tragedy lies in everything that would never happen afterward. The birthdays not celebrated. The conversations not shared. The grandchildren not met. The careers not completed. The memories never created. Violence steals futures as much as it steals lives. As evening settled over Toronto on April 23, families, friends, survivors, and witnesses struggled to comprehend what had happened. A city mourned. Questions multiplied. Shock settled into grief. And while investigators worked to identify a motive and reconstruct events, countless people faced a far more personal reality. Someone they loved was gone. Someone they cared about had been injured. Someone they knew would never again walk through a familiar doorway. These human stories formed the true center of the tragedy. Because before there was an investigation, before there was a trial, before there were debates about ideology and motive, there were people. Ordinary people. Good people. People who had expected nothing more dramatic from that Monday than finishing work, returning home, and continuing their lives. Instead, their stories became forever intertwined with one of the deadliest attacks in modern Canadian history. And as the afternoon of April 23 continued unfolding, the ordinary world they inhabited was about to be shattered by a single act of devastating violence. April 23, 2018. The clock was moving steadily through the early afternoon. For most people in North York, it was the least remarkable part of the day. Lunch breaks were ending. Meetings were about to begin. Students were making their way between classes. Workers were checking emails and glancing at schedules. Traffic flowed along Yonge Street in its usual rhythm, neither especially heavy nor unusually light. The city felt alive but calm, energized by the long-awaited arrival of spring. Pedestrians filled the sidewalks. Some walked alone. Others moved in pairs or small groups. Conversations drifted through the air. Storefront windows reflected sunlight. The ordinary sounds of urban life blended together into a familiar background that nobody paid much attention to. Nothing appeared out of place. And then, at approximately 1:22 p.m., everything changed. A white Chevrolet Express rental van approached the area. To anyone watching casually, it looked like countless other commercial vehicles that traveled Toronto streets every day. It was not flashy. It was not remarkable. It did not announce itself. That was part of what made the coming violence so shocking. Danger often arrives wearing ordinary clothes. Witnesses would later recall how quickly events unfolded. One moment, the van was simply another vehicle. The next, it mounted the sidewalk. At first, some people struggled to understand what they were seeing. The human brain naturally searches for innocent explanations. Perhaps the driver had lost control. Perhaps there had been a medical emergency. Perhaps it was a terrible accident. Those assumptions lasted only moments. Because the vehicle kept going. And then it became impossible to deny what was happening. The van was not merely out of control. It was moving deliberately. Purposefully. The driver continued along the crowded sidewalk, turning an ordinary public space into a corridor of panic. The transformation happened almost instantly. People who had been focused on daily routines suddenly found themselves running for safety. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Coffee cups dropped to the pavement. Shopping bags fell from startled hands. The normal flow of life shattered. Witnesses later described scenes of confusion unlike anything they had ever experienced. Many could not immediately process the reality before them. Some heard screams before they understood the cause. Others noticed crowds moving suddenly and instinctively followed. Several described a feeling of disbelief, as though their minds rejected what their eyes were seeing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not on an ordinary Monday afternoon. Yet reality was unfolding whether anyone was ready for it or not. The van continued forward. Block after block. Minute after minute. The distance covered was significant. Nearly 2 kilometers of sidewalk became part of the attack. For those caught in its path, there was often little warning. A sound. A sudden movement. A flash of white. Then chaos. Many survivors later spoke about how quickly normal perception disappeared. Time seemed distorted. Seconds felt longer. Details became unusually vivid. The color of a traffic light. A stranger's expression. The reflection of sunlight on glass. The sound of shoes striking concrete while running. Trauma has a way of imprinting moments into memory with painful clarity. Across Yonge Street, people reacted differently. Some fled. Some froze. Some tried to help others. Human beings often reveal their character most clearly during moments of crisis. While one individual was creating terror, countless others were displaying courage. Complete strangers reached for one another. People shouted warnings. Some directed others toward safety. Others immediately began assisting those who had been injured. Many acted without hesitation. Without knowing whether danger had fully passed. Without considering their own safety first. Acts of heroism rarely announce themselves. Often they appear as ordinary people making extraordinary decisions in impossible circumstances. That afternoon provided many examples. As the attack unfolded, emergency calls flooded dispatch centers. The phones began ringing almost simultaneously. Witnesses struggled to explain what they were seeing. Voices carried panic, confusion, fear. Dispatchers worked rapidly to gather information while trying to determine exactly what was happening. The reports sounded almost unbelievable. A vehicle on the sidewalk. Multiple pedestrians struck. Large numbers of injured people. The scale of the situation became apparent quickly. Police officers, firefighters, and paramedics were dispatched immediately. But even before professional responders arrived, ordinary citizens had already begun helping. Some knelt beside injured strangers. Others attempted to comfort those in shock. People offered jackets, water, reassurance, anything they could provide. The attack itself lasted only minutes. Yet for those who lived through it, those minutes felt far longer. Every second seemed stretched. Every decision carried urgency. Every moment mattered. Meanwhile, inside the van sat the man responsible. Alec Minassian. 25 years old. Driving through a city that had no idea what was unfolding inside his mind. Investigators would later spend years examining his motives, his beliefs, and his state of mind. But in that moment, one reality stood above all others. His actions were creating devastation. Lives were being altered forever. Families were unknowingly approaching the worst moments of their lives. And a city was about to be transformed. Eventually, the van came to a stop. The physical movement ended. The consequences did not. The aftermath began immediately. Witnesses emerged from hiding places. People looked around trying to understand what had happened. The scene felt surreal. A place that had looked completely normal only minutes earlier now felt unfamiliar. Disoriented. Broken. Sirens grew louder. Emergency vehicles converged on the area. Roads were closed. Authorities rushed to secure the scene. The scale of the response reflected the scale of the tragedy. Many witnesses later struggled to describe their emotions. Shock dominated everything. Not simply sadness. Not immediately. Shock. The mind often protects itself during overwhelming events by delaying emotional processing. People moved through the aftermath almost mechanically. Helping. Calling loved ones. Answering questions. Trying to make sense of what they had seen. The full emotional impact would arrive later. Hours later. Days later. Sometimes months later. For many, the memories would remain vivid for years. As police worked to understand the situation, another dramatic moment unfolded nearby. Minassian exited the vehicle. The attack itself had ended, but a tense confrontation was about to begin. Police officers located him shortly afterward. What followed would become one of the most widely discussed moments connected to the case. Confronted by law enforcement, Minassian behaved in a manner that appeared calculated. Witnesses observed a strange encounter. He gestured aggressively. At points, he appeared to challenge officers. To provoke them. To encourage a deadly response. The situation was dangerous. Unpredictable. The officer facing him had only seconds to evaluate the threat. One wrong decision could have produced even more tragedy. Yet despite the tension, the confrontation ended without gunfire. Toronto police officer Ken Lam remained composed under extraordinary pressure. While Manassian attempted to escalate the encounter, Lam refused to lose control. The officer maintained discipline, maintained focus, maintained restraint. Eventually, Manassian surrendered. He was taken into custody alive. The significance of that moment would become clearer in the years ahead. Had the encounter ended differently, many questions surrounding the attack might never have been answered. Instead, investigators would have the opportunity to speak directly with the perpetrator, to examine his motives, to understand his planning, to reconstruct the path that led to violence. But those developments belonged to the future. At that moment, emergency responders remained focused on a more urgent reality. People needed help. The attack zone stretched across a significant portion of Yonge Street. Responders moved rapidly between locations. Medical teams treated victims. Police secured evidence. Witnesses were identified and interviewed. The complexity of the scene presented enormous challenges. Unlike a single location incident, this attack had unfolded across a lengthy route. Evidence existed in multiple places. Witnesses had observed different portions of the event. Investigators would eventually need to reconstruct every movement, every decision, every minute. As afternoon gradually turned toward evening, news began spreading across Toronto. Then across Canada. Then around the world. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Online news alerts appeared on phones. Social media filled with confusion, concern, and rapidly developing information. Families rushed to contact loved ones. Friends checked on friends. Co-workers exchanged messages. The city collectively searched for answers. How many people had been hurt? Who was responsible? Why had this happened? The questions multiplied faster than answers could arrive. What people did know was devastating enough. A mass casualty attack had occurred in broad daylight. On one of Toronto's busiest streets. Against ordinary pedestrians. The randomness of the violence made it especially disturbing. The victims had not been selected because of personal conflicts. Most had never met the attacker. Their lives intersected only because they happened to be present. That realization spread fear throughout the community. If such violence could occur during a routine afternoon walk, what assumptions about safety remained intact? As darkness approached, memorials began appearing. Flowers. Messages. Candles. Small acts of remembrance emerging almost immediately. Even before the full scope of the tragedy was known, people felt compelled to gather. To mourn. To support one another. To acknowledge the immense loss that had occurred. Yet beneath the grief lingered another emotion. Disbelief. Many residents struggled to reconcile the attack with their image of Toronto. The city had experienced tragedy before. Every major city has. But this felt different. The sheer randomness. The public setting. The vulnerability of the victims. All of it combined to create a profound sense of shock. For the families directly affected, however, broader societal questions mattered little. They were confronting something deeply personal. A missing loved one. An unanswered phone call. An uncertain future. While news organizations reported developments and investigators collected evidence, families waited. Some waited for updates from hospitals. Others waited for official confirmation. Many clung desperately to hope. The hours following a disaster often become a painful blur. Time moves strangely. Minutes feel endless. Every phone call carries possibility. Every notification triggers anxiety. Every piece of information matters. Across Toronto, countless people were entering that difficult period of uncertainty. And while the attack itself had lasted only minutes, its consequences were just beginning. The violence on Yonge Street was over. The suffering it created was not. In the coming days, investigators would begin uncovering who Alek Minassian was and what had motivated him. The public would learn about disturbing online ideologies. Psychologists would examine questions of radicalization and resentment. Journalists would reconstruct timelines. Lawyers would prepare for years of legal proceedings. But on the evening of April 23, none of those future developments could change the reality facing Toronto. An ordinary spring afternoon had become one of the darkest days in the city's history. Lives had been lost. Families had been shattered. Survivors had been traumatized. And a community that woke expecting a normal Monday was now confronting a tragedy it would never forget. The first minutes after a mass casualty attack are often defined by confusion. The first hours are defined by questions. And the first night is defined by evidence. As the sun slowly descended over Toronto on April 23, 2018, the frantic urgency of emergency medical response began giving way to something else. The investigation had begun. Yonge Street no longer resembled the busy corridor it had been only hours earlier. Traffic was gone. Pedestrians had disappeared. Police vehicles lined the roadway. Emergency lights reflected from glass buildings and storefront windows. Sections of the street remained sealed behind barriers as investigators moved carefully through an environment that had transformed from a public sidewalk into one of the largest crime scenes in modern Canadian history. For many residents watching from nearby buildings, the scene felt surreal. The same sidewalks they had crossed hundreds of times were now occupied by forensic teams. The same intersections where people normally waited for traffic lights were marked by evidence indicators. The ordinary geography of daily life had become the geography of tragedy. Investigators understood immediately that the scale of the crime presented enormous challenges. This was not a single location. The attack had stretched across nearly 2 kilometers. Evidence existed everywhere. Every section of sidewalk potentially contained crucial information. Every witness had seen a different piece of the puzzle. Every photograph, every security camera recording, every emergency call could contribute to understanding exactly what had happened. The task ahead would require patience, precision, and extraordinary attention to detail. As forensic officers moved through the area, they documented everything. A crime scene tells a story. Not through words. Through objects. Through positions. Through patterns. A dropped backpack. A damaged bench. Fragments of vehicle debris. Personal belongings left behind during moments of panic. Each item represented more than physical evidence. Each item represented a human moment. A life interrupted. A routine shattered. A person who had been standing in a particular place at a particular second when history suddenly changed. Investigators photographed everything before touching anything. Measurements were recorded. Locations were mapped. Distances were calculated. The route of the van would eventually need to be reconstructed with extraordinary accuracy. Not simply for the investigation. Not simply for prosecutors. But for the families who deserved answers. One of the most difficult aspects of any major criminal investigation is separating emotion from process. The scene confronting investigators was heartbreaking. Many officers had spent their entire careers preparing for situations like this without ever expecting to encounter one. Yet professionalism demanded focus. Every piece of evidence mattered. Every detail needed preservation. Every observation required documentation. Mistakes made during the first hours of an investigation can echo throughout an entire legal case. The pressure was immense. Meanwhile, detectives began the enormous task of identifying witnesses. And there were many. Hundreds of people had been present along Yonge Street that afternoon. Some had witnessed the beginning of the attack. Others had seen only portions of it. Some had provided assistance to victims. Others had observed the van passing from a distance. Every account mattered. Yet eyewitness testimony is often complicated. Human memory does not function like a video recording. People experience trauma differently. Two individuals can witness the same event and remember different details. Fear affects perception. Shock affects perception. Adrenaline affects perception. Investigators understood this. Their job was not to collect a single story. It was to collect hundreds of stories and determine where they overlapped, where they matched, where they diverged, and gradually build a reliable timeline. Interview rooms remained busy throughout the evening. Witnesses described screams, confusion, people running, the sudden realization that the vehicle was intentionally targeting pedestrians. Many struggled emotionally while recounting what they had seen. Some became visibly shaken. Others spoke in fragmented memories. Many had never experienced anything remotely similar. For them, simply describing the event meant reliving it. At the same time, investigators began gathering surveillance footage. Modern cities are filled with cameras. Traffic cameras. Security cameras. Storefront cameras. Office building cameras. Private surveillance systems. Collectively, they provide countless angles of daily life. On April 23, those cameras became silent witnesses. Detectives quickly realized that video evidence would play a critical role. The attack had occurred in broad daylight, along a busy urban corridor. Numerous systems had captured portions of the event. Technicians worked rapidly to secure recordings before they could be overwritten or lost. Hour by hour, investigators assembled a visual timeline. Different angles. Different perspectives. Different moments. Together, they revealed the path taken by the van. The speed. The movements. The decisions made by the driver. The footage reinforced a deeply troubling conclusion. This was not an accident. There was no indication of confusion. No evidence of mechanical failure. No signs suggesting an unintended loss of control. The actions appeared deliberate, purposeful, intentional. That conclusion fundamentally shaped the direction of the investigation. While forensic teams examined the scene, another group of investigators focused on a different question. Who exactly was Alec Minassian? The answer initially seemed surprisingly ordinary. 25 years old. Resident of Richmond Hill. No extensive violent criminal history. No reputation that immediately suggested mass murder. The contrast between the attack and the attacker's outward appearance puzzled investigators. In many cases, people imagine perpetrators of large-scale violence as obvious threats. Individuals who display unmistakable warning signs. Individuals whose future actions seem predictable in hindsight. Reality is often more complicated. Many dangerous individuals appear unremarkable until the moment they act. As detectives explored Minassian's background, they began constructing a timeline of his life. Family relationships. Educational history. Employment records. Social interactions. Online activity. Everything became relevant. Everything demanded examination. Every major investigation eventually reaches a critical point where the question shifts from what happened to why it happened. On the evening of April 23, investigators had not yet reached that point. The what still required enormous effort. But clues regarding the why were already beginning to emerge. One of the most important developments occurred surprisingly quickly. Authorities discovered an online post connected to Minassian. The message had been published shortly before the attack. At first glance, it appeared strange. Almost cryptic. Yet its significance became impossible to ignore. The post referenced the so-called incel movement and praised a previous mass killer whose actions had become notorious within certain extremist online communities. For investigators, the discovery immediately raised alarm. This was no longer merely a story about one individual's actions. It potentially involved ideology, radicalization, online influence, a belief system. Those possibilities dramatically expanded the scope of the case. The Internet has transformed modern investigations. In previous generations, detectives searched filing cabinets, notebooks, and physical records. Today, they often search digital footprints, messages, posts, search histories, online communities, virtual interactions. Human beings reveal themselves online in ways they sometimes never do in person. And increasingly, investigators understand that the internet can provide a window into motive. As analysts examined Minassian's digital presence, disturbing patterns began appearing. Communities built around resentment. Discussions centered on rejection and anger. Language reflecting hostility toward women. References to extremist beliefs that many people had never even heard of. For experienced investigators, these discoveries suggested that the attack may have been connected to a broader subculture rather than a purely personal grievance. That distinction mattered enormously, because understanding motive helps prevent future violence. Understanding motive helps identify warning signs. Understanding motive helps society recognize emerging threats. Yet investigators remained cautious. Early assumptions can be dangerous. Evidence must lead conclusions, not the other way around. Every finding required verification. Every theory required testing. Meanwhile, public attention intensified. News organizations worked around the clock. Information spread rapidly. Speculation spread even faster. In the aftermath of major tragedies, rumors often emerge before facts. Social media amplified uncertainty. Questions circulated constantly. Was the attack terrorism? Was it politically motivated? Was it connected to international organizations? Had authorities missed warning signs? People wanted answers immediately. Investigators understood that answers take time, especially accurate ones. Back at the crime scene, forensic work continued deep into the night. Powerful lights illuminated sections of roadway. Evidence technicians remained methodical despite exhaustion. The process appeared slow from the outside. But thorough investigations always do. Every detail matters. Every detail contributes. A single overlooked piece of information can change an entire case. By the early morning hours, investigators possessed a growing collection of evidence. Witness statements, video recordings, physical evidence, digital information, initial interviews. Yet the overall picture remained incomplete. They knew who had committed the attack. That question had been answered almost immediately. The more difficult challenge involved understanding the path that led there. Mass violence rarely emerges from a single moment. It develops over time. A series of choices. A series of influences. A series of grievances. The attack on Yonge Street represented the final act of a much longer story. Investigators now faced the challenge of uncovering every chapter that came before. As Toronto struggled to process the tragedy, families began receiving devastating confirmations. Names were identified. Notifications were delivered. Lives changed forever. The human consequences of the attack became increasingly clear. For detectives, those consequences created an additional sense of responsibility. This was not merely another criminal file. Not merely another investigation. Real people had lost loved ones. Real survivors were facing physical and emotional recovery. The pursuit of truth carried enormous weight. And somewhere within thousands of pages of evidence, hundreds of witness accounts, countless hours of video footage, and an increasingly complex digital trail, investigators believed the answers existed. The crime scene had begun speaking. The evidence had begun revealing its story. But the most important discoveries were still ahead. Because the deeper detectives looked into Alec Minassian's life, the more they realized that the attack was connected to a disturbing world hidden behind computer screens, a world that would soon become one of the most important aspects of the entire case. In the days following the attack, Toronto found itself trapped between grief and uncertainty. The city knew who had committed the crime. That question had been answered almost immediately. Alec Minassian was in custody. The attack had been captured by witnesses, surveillance cameras, and the remarkable restraint of the police officer who arrested him. But another question lingered over every conversation, every news broadcast, and every investigation meeting. Why? Why would a 25-year-old man rent a van, drive to one of the busiest pedestrian corridors in the city, and deliberately target strangers? The answer did not reveal itself quickly. Like many major criminal investigations, the case unfolded through layers. Every answer uncovered another question. Every clue opened a new avenue of inquiry. And for investigators, the most dangerous mistake would have been assuming they already understood the truth. The attack appeared deliberate. That much was obvious. But deliberate violence can emerge from many different motives. Terrorism, personal revenge, psychological crisis, political extremism, hatred, fame-seeking, mental illness. Investigators could not afford to choose a theory before examining the evidence. Their responsibility was to follow facts wherever those facts led. The first days were consumed by an enormous volume of work. Detectives interviewed family members, former classmates, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who had known Minassian. Every conversation helped build a picture of the man behind the crime. At first, many descriptions sounded surprisingly similar. Awkward, quiet, socially isolated, unremarkable. Again and again, people struggled to reconcile the person they remembered with the scale of the violence he had committed. This reaction is common after mass casualty events. Society often expects perpetrators to appear obviously dangerous. People imagine warning signs that should have been impossible to miss. Yet reality frequently proves more complicated. Many individuals who commit horrific crimes spend years appearing ordinary to those around them. Not because they are secretly criminal masterminds, but because human beings often conceal large portions of their inner lives. The version of ourselves that co-workers see is different from the version seen by family. The version seen by family is different from the version that exists online. And sometimes the most important parts remain hidden from everyone. Investigators soon discovered that Minassian's life had been marked by significant social difficulties. He struggled to form connections, struggled to build relationships, struggled to navigate social situations that many people take for granted. For years, these struggles appeared to create a growing sense of frustration. Yet frustration alone does not explain mass violence. Millions of people experience rejection without becoming killers. Millions experience loneliness without harming anyone. The investigation therefore focused on a critical question. What transformed personal disappointment into public violence? The answer appeared increasingly connected to the internet. As digital forensic specialists examined computers, online activity, and electronic communications, a troubling picture began to emerge. Investigators encountered references to communities built around resentment. Communities where personal failure was rarely examined honestly. Communities where blame was directed outward. Toward society. Toward women. Toward anyone perceived as successful. The deeper investigators looked, the more frequently they encountered references to the incel movement. The term itself was unfamiliar to much of the public. Many Canadians hearing it for the first time had no idea what it meant. But investigators quickly realized it could not be ignored. Certain online spaces associated with the ideology had developed reputations for hostility, misogyny, and fantasies of revenge. Participants often described themselves as victims of an unfair social hierarchy. Within these communities, some members elevated individuals who committed acts of violence. Mass killers became symbols. Not because their actions solved anything. Not because their grievances were legitimate. But because violence attracted attention. And attention became a form of validation. Investigators discovered evidence suggesting that Minassian had immersed himself in this world. Yet even this discovery failed to provide complete clarity. The challenge facing detectives was distinguishing influence from motive. Did he genuinely believe the ideology? Did he simply adopt its language? Was he seeking acceptance? Was he seeking notoriety? Or was the truth some combination of all three? These questions proved surprisingly difficult to answer. The deeper investigators explored, the more contradictions appeared. On one hand, there were online statements that seemed to align with extremist beliefs. On the other hand, there were aspects of his personal history that suggested someone desperate for significance. Someone searching for an identity. Someone who felt invisible. One of the recurring themes emerging from interviews involved social isolation. Many people described Minassian as disconnected from others. Not openly aggressive. Not obviously violent. Simply detached. Living largely on the margins of social life. Isolation can create a dangerous vulnerability. Not because loneliness automatically produces violence, but because lonely individuals sometimes become susceptible to communities that offer belonging. Even unhealthy belonging. Even destructive belonging. Human beings possess a fundamental need for connection. When healthy connections are absent, unhealthy ones can become surprisingly powerful. Investigators examined years of digital activity searching for evidence of planning. Evidence of radicalization. Evidence of intent. What they found suggested that the attack had not been a spontaneous act. The rental van. The online statements. The choices made that day. Together they indicated preparation. Preparation meant the attack had existed first as an idea. An idea nurtured privately before becoming reality. Understanding how that idea developed became one of the central goals of the investigation. Yet every theory encountered obstacles. Some experts argued that ideology stood at the center of the crime. Others believed the attack reflected a desperate desire for recognition. Still others emphasized psychological factors. The investigation increasingly resembled a puzzle with missing pieces. And the most frustrating puzzles are those where multiple explanations seem partially true. As detectives continued their work, media coverage expanded dramatically. The public wanted clear answers. Clear motives. Clear conclusions. Investigators had none. Not yet. The reality was far more complicated than many expected. Human beings often commit terrible acts for reasons that resist simple explanation. There is a temptation after every tragedy to identify a single cause. One event. One belief. One turning point. Reality rarely cooperates. Violence typically emerges from a combination of factors. Experiences. Choices. Influences. Personal vulnerabilities. And in the Toronto case, the evidence suggested exactly that kind of complexity. Meanwhile, another question emerged. Had anyone seen warning signs? This question appears after nearly every major act of violence. Friends wonder if they missed clues. Families revisit old memories. Communities search for moments that now seem significant. Investigators did the same. They reviewed educational records, personal history, behavioral patterns, digital communications. Yet hindsight can be deceptive. Once an outcome is known, ordinary events suddenly appear suspicious. Comments that once seemed insignificant acquire new meaning. Moments that once seemed forgettable become warning signs. The challenge for investigators was separating genuine indicators from hindsight bias. Not every awkward individual becomes dangerous. Not every angry online comment predicts violence. Not every socially isolated person represents a threat. Finding meaningful warning signs required caution. As weeks passed, the investigation continued expanding. Experts in psychology became involved. Specialists in online extremism analyzed digital evidence. Behavioral analysts examined patterns. Every discipline brought a different perspective. Some focused on ideology. Others focused on mental health. Others focused on social influences. Together they attempted to answer the same question. What happened inside Alek Minassian's mind before April 23? The answer remained elusive. Yet certain themes appeared repeatedly. Isolation. Resentment. Identity. Recognition. belonging. Each seemed connected to the path that eventually led to violence. For detectives, however, theories were never enough. The legal system requires evidence. Concrete evidence. Provable evidence. The challenge was building a case capable of surviving scrutiny inside a courtroom. Every conclusion would eventually face examination by defense attorneys, prosecutors, experts, and judges. Every statement needed support. Every claim required proof. The investigation therefore proceeded carefully, patiently, methodically. While the public searched for certainty, investigators remained focused on facts. And facts often arrive slowly. Months after the attack, enormous quantities of information had been collected. Witness testimony, video evidence, digital records, psychological assessments, interviews, forensic analysis. The case file continued growing. Yet despite all this material, one reality remained unchanged. The attack was not the result of a single bad day. It was not the result of a sudden impulse. It represented the culmination of a longer process. A process investigators were only beginning to understand. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that the key to the entire case lay not merely in what happened on Yonge Street but in the years that came before it. Somewhere within those years existed the turning points. The influences. The decisions. The moments that transformed grievance into violence. And eventually, as evidence continued accumulating, investigators would uncover a breakthrough that brought them closer than ever to understanding the attack. A breakthrough that would reshape public understanding of the case and become one of the most important developments in the pursuit of justice. The breakthrough did not arrive as a dramatic confession. It did not emerge from a hidden witness suddenly stepping forward. It did not come from a forgotten piece of physical evidence discovered beneath a pile of documents. Instead, it emerged slowly, through the convergence of hundreds of small details that investigators had been collecting since the day of the attack. Like pieces of a mosaic scattered across a table, each fragment meant little on its own. Together, they revealed a disturbing picture. By the time investigators reached this stage of the case, they had reconstructed nearly every movement connected to April 23, 2018. They knew where Alek Minassian had gone. They knew when he had rented the van. They knew the route he had taken. They knew what he had done. What remained uncertain was why. And in many ways, motive represented the most important question of all. The public wanted an explanation. The victims' families wanted an explanation. The courts would eventually need an explanation. Yet the deeper investigators searched, the more complicated that explanation became. What finally shifted the investigation forward was not a single discovery but the growing significance of Minassian's own words. In the aftermath of the attack, investigators had the rare opportunity to speak directly with the perpetrator. Many major cases never provide that opportunity. Sometimes offenders die during the event. Sometimes they refuse to cooperate. Sometimes they offer nothing but silence. Minassian did neither. He talked. And what he said became one of the most important elements of the entire investigation. Interviews conducted after his arrest revealed a young man who seemed eager to discuss aspects of his thinking. Not necessarily because he felt remorse. Not necessarily because he wanted to help investigators. But because he appeared fascinated by the attention surrounding the event. That fascination itself became significant. Investigators noticed something unusual. While discussing the attack, Minassian often seemed less focused on the suffering he had caused and more focused on how his actions might be perceived. The distinction mattered. It suggested a mindset centered not on the victims but on himself. A mindset concerned with recognition, visibility, impact. 4 years, according to evidence collected during the investigation, he had experienced profound social isolation. Now, suddenly, the entire country knew his name. 4 behavioral analysts examining the case, this observation raised important questions. Was ideology truly the primary motive? Or had ideology become a vehicle for something else? A desire to matter. A desire to be noticed. A desire to force the world to acknowledge his existence. The investigation increasingly pointed toward a combination of factors rather than a single cause. The online evidence remained important. Investigators continued examining the communities Minassian had referenced before the attack. These communities frequently promoted narratives built around resentment and perceived injustice. Members often portrayed themselves as victims of a social system they believed had excluded them. Some expressed hostility toward women. Others celebrated previous acts of violence. Many encouraged one another's grievances rather than challenging them. Yet investigators noticed something crucial. Minassian's involvement appeared more complex than that of a committed ideological extremist. He referenced the community. He adopted some of its language. But his personal history suggested additional motivations operating beneath the surface. One recurring theme emerged repeatedly: status, recognition, significance. Throughout his life, he often appeared to struggle with feelings of inadequacy and invisibility. Relationships had proven difficult. Social interactions had proven difficult. Personal achievements often fell short of expectations. Again and again, investigators encountered evidence suggesting someone searching desperately for identity. And in extremist online spaces, identity can become dangerously easy to find. Such communities offer explanations. Simple explanations. Seductive explanations. They transform personal disappointments into collective grievances. They provide villains. They provide heroes. They provide belonging. Most importantly, they provide meaning. For someone struggling with isolation, that meaning can feel powerful. As investigators assembled these observations, the attack began to appear less like an inexplicable eruption of violence and more like the final stage of a gradual process. A process involving loneliness, resentment, online reinforcement, and a growing obsession with significance. Still, proving these conclusions required more than theory. Investigators needed evidence capable of surviving legal scrutiny. They therefore continued examining every available source: digital communications, search histories, interview statements, personal records, behavioral assessments. The resulting picture became increasingly detailed. One of the most revealing aspects of the investigation involved the attacker's apparent admiration for previous mass killers. This admiration was not unique to Minassian. Experts studying mass violence have observed similar patterns in numerous cases. Some offenders become fascinated by individuals who achieved notoriety through horrific acts. The violence itself becomes intertwined with fame. The crime becomes intertwined with recognition. The offender begins viewing previous attackers less as criminals and more as models. Investigators believed elements of this pattern were present here. The attack seemed designed not only to cause harm but also to create attention. Massive attention. National attention. Global attention. And unfortunately, it succeeded. For analysts working the case, this realization represented a major breakthrough. Because it helped explain several previously confusing elements. It explained the public nature of the attack. It explained the timing. It explained certain statements made before and after the event. Most importantly, it connected multiple pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative. Yet another breakthrough emerged from psychological evaluations. Mental health experts spent significant time examining Minassian's history, behavior, and thought processes. The goal was not to excuse the crime. The goal was understanding. Courts require understanding. Justice requires understanding. And understanding often demands careful examination of psychology. The evaluations revealed a complicated individual. Someone capable of planning. Capable of understanding consequences. Capable of making deliberate decisions. This finding would become enormously important. Because one potential avenue of defense involved questions regarding criminal responsibility. If psychological factors had impaired his ability to understand his actions, the legal implications would be profound. But the evidence increasingly suggested otherwise. Investigators and experts found substantial indications of planning, preparation, intent. The attack did not appear random. It did not appear impulsive. It reflected conscious decision-making. That conclusion strengthened the prosecution's position considerably. As months passed, the investigation evolved from fact-finding into case-building. The broad outlines of the story had become clear. A socially isolated young man. Exposure to toxic online communities. Growing resentment. A desire for significance. Deliberate preparation. A devastating act of violence. Yet even with this framework established, investigators remained cautious. Human motivation is rarely simple. Reducing the attack to a single explanation would risk oversimplifying reality. The breakthrough, therefore, was not the discovery of one definitive cause. The breakthrough was recognizing how multiple factors intersected. Loneliness alone did not cause the attack. Ideology alone did not cause the attack. A desire for recognition alone did not cause the attack. Together, however, they created a dangerous combination. One that eventually culminated in tragedy. By this stage, prosecutors were gaining confidence in their ability to present the case before a court. The evidence was substantial. The timeline was clear. The intent appeared demonstrable. The challenge ahead would involve translating years of investigation into a legal argument capable of delivering justice. For the victims' families, the breakthrough brought mixed emotions. On one hand, answers were emerging. The fog surrounding the attack was beginning to clear. Investigators could explain more than they could in the chaotic days immediately following the tragedy. On the other hand, explanations never eliminate grief. Understanding why something happened does not reverse it. It does not restore lost lives. It does not erase trauma. It merely replaces uncertainty with knowledge. And sometimes that knowledge carries its own weight. Many family members struggled with the realization that the attack appeared rooted in grievances and fantasies that had been nurtured for years. The tragedy had not emerged from nowhere. It had been developing quietly. Largely unnoticed. Hidden behind screens. Hidden inside private thoughts. Hidden behind the appearance of ordinary life. That realization disturbed many people. Because it forced society to confront uncomfortable questions. How many others occupied similar online spaces? How many individuals were consuming similar content? How could communities identify warning signs before violence occurred? These questions extended far beyond a single criminal case. They touched on broader concerns regarding radicalization, online influence, and social isolation. But those discussions belonged to the future. For investigators, the immediate focus remained the legal process ahead. The breakthrough had provided clarity. The evidence now pointed toward a coherent explanation. Not a perfect explanation. Not a complete explanation. But a sufficiently supported explanation. The pieces fit together. The timeline made sense. The motive, while complex, had become understandable. And with that understanding came the next phase of the journey. The courtroom. A place where evidence would be tested. Arguments would be challenged. Experts would testify. And the families of the victims would finally witness the legal system confront the man responsible for one of the darkest days in Toronto's history. The investigation had revealed the path that led to violence. Now the question became whether justice could provide some measure of accountability for the devastation left behind. Justice moves differently from grief. Grief arrives immediately. It crashes into families without warning. It settles into homes, hospitals, funeral services, and quiet moments of remembrance. It changes lives in a single day. Justice, by contrast, moves slowly, carefully, methodically. The legal system is designed that way. Every piece of evidence must be examined. Every argument must be tested. Every conclusion must withstand scrutiny. For the families affected by the Toronto van attack, This difference created a painful reality. While their lives had been permanently altered in April of 2018, the legal process would take years to reach its conclusion. Years of waiting. Years of hearings. Years of legal arguments. Years of revisiting memories many desperately wished they could forget. Yet those years also carried a purpose. The purpose was accountability. The purpose was truth. And ultimately, the purpose was justice. As prosecutors prepared their case against Alec Minassian, the scale of the evidence was overwhelming. Investigators had reconstructed the attack in extraordinary detail. Surveillance footage documented the route. Witness testimony confirmed the sequence of events. Digital evidence illuminated aspects of motive and planning. The physical evidence left little doubt regarding responsibility. Unlike some criminal cases where identity remains uncertain, the central question was never whether Minassian committed the attack. The evidence established that clearly. Instead, the legal battle would focus on a more complicated issue. Criminal responsibility. Could he be held fully responsible for his actions under Canadian law? The answer carried enormous consequences. Inside courtrooms, legal proceedings often appear technical from the outside. Arguments revolve around definitions, standards, interpretations. Yet beneath those legal discussions lie profoundly human questions. Did the offender understand what he was doing? Did he understand the consequences? Did he understand right from wrong? These questions became central to the case. As hearings progressed, prosecutors presented a picture of deliberate violence. A rented van. A planned route. A conscious decision to target pedestrians. Actions that demonstrated intent. Actions that reflected preparation. Actions that suggested awareness rather than confusion. Again and again, evidence pointed toward planning. Planning matters enormously in criminal law. It distinguishes spontaneous actions from deliberate ones. It reveals intent. And intent often shapes legal responsibility. The prosecution argued that the attack represented a calculated act. Not an accident. Not a momentary lapse. Not an uncontrollable impulse. A conscious choice. The defense, meanwhile, focused heavily on psychological factors. Mental health experts became central figures in the proceedings. They analyzed years of personal history, behavioral patterns, social difficulties, developmental challenges, psychological assessments. The courtroom increasingly became a place where law and psychology intersected. This intersection is rarely simple. Human beings are complicated. Mental health exists on a spectrum. A person can experience psychological difficulties while still understanding their actions. A person can struggle socially while remaining legally responsible. Determining where those boundaries exist requires careful examination. Expert testimony occupied a significant portion of the proceedings. Specialists discussed social isolation, obsessive thinking, online influences, personal development, behavioral traits. Each expert offered insights into how Minassian's mind functioned. The discussions were often highly detailed, sometimes technical. But beneath the terminology existed a fundamental question. Was this a man incapable of understanding his actions? Or was this a man who understood exactly what he was doing? The answer would ultimately determine much of the case. For the victims' families, these proceedings could be emotionally exhausting. Courtrooms are places of evidence. Evidence often means revisiting painful realities. Details of the attack had to be examined. Timelines had to be reconstructed. Victim impact could not be separated from legal analysis. Families listened as lawyers discussed events that had shattered their lives. Many described the experience as difficult but necessary. Painful but important. Because accountability required confronting the truth directly. Throughout the proceedings, the victims remained at the center of the case. Not as statistics. Not as numbers. But as human beings whose lives had value. Photographs. Personal stories. Family memories. These reminders served an important purpose. The legal process was not merely evaluating the offender. It was also acknowledging the people he had harmed. One of the most significant moments involved the examination of motive. By this stage, investigators had developed a much clearer understanding of the influences surrounding the attack. Evidence connected Minassian to online communities associated with incel ideology. The courtroom heard discussions about resentment, social rejection, extremist narratives, the desire for recognition. Yet even here, the picture remained complicated. The court ultimately faced the challenge of distinguishing explanation from excuse. An explanation helps us understand why something happened. An excuse attempts to justify it. The legal system recognizes the importance of understanding motives. But understanding does not erase responsibility. Many people experience loneliness. Many experience rejection. Many struggle with social connection. The overwhelming majority never commit violence. This distinction remained important throughout the proceedings. As the trial unfolded, the evidence consistently pointed toward deliberate decision-making. The rental vehicle had not appeared by chance. The route had not been selected by chance. The attack itself had not unfolded by chance. Each step reflected choices. And those choices carried consequences. The courtroom also revisited the dramatic arrest that occurred shortly after the attack. The confrontation between Minassian and Officer Ken Lam became an important element of the broader narrative. Many observers continued to view Lam's actions as remarkable. Faced with a tense and uncertain situation, he had demonstrated extraordinary restraint. The encounter ended without additional bloodshed, without additional victims, without unnecessary escalation. In the years following the attack, that moment would often be cited as an example of disciplined policing under extreme pressure. Yet even as attention occasionally returned to the arrest, the central focus remained the victims and the search for accountability. Months became years. Legal processes continued. Arguments were presented. Evidence was examined. Experts testified. The machinery of justice moved forward. Then came one of the most significant moments in the entire case. The verdict. Courtrooms often become unusually quiet during verdicts. The tension feels different. Everyone present understands the significance of what is about to happen. Families, lawyers, journalists, observers. Each person waits for words that will shape the future. In 2021, the court delivered its decision. Alec Minassian was found guilty. The verdict represented a major milestone. Not because it could undo the tragedy. Nothing could do that. But because it established legal accountability. The court concluded that he bore responsibility for the attack. Responsibility for the lives lost. Responsibility for the injuries inflicted. Responsibility for the devastation left behind. For many families, the verdict brought a measure of relief. Not happiness. Justice and happiness are not the same thing. The people they loved remained gone. The injuries remained real. The trauma remained present. But accountability mattered. Truth mattered. Recognition of responsibility mattered. The legal process had affirmed what they already knew. The attack was a deliberate act. And the individual responsible would be held accountable. Yet the story did not end there. Sentencing remained. Sentencing carries its own significance. A verdict answers the question of guilt. A sentence answers the question of consequence. How should society respond? How should the legal system address harm of this magnitude? These questions are never simple. Particularly in cases involving multiple victims and profound community impact. When sentencing proceedings eventually concluded, the result reflected the seriousness of the crime. In June 2022, Minassian received a sentence of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The sentence represented one of the most severe penalties available under Canadian law. For many observers, It reflected the extraordinary scale of the tragedy. The number of lives lost. The number of people injured. The deliberate nature of the attack. The devastating impact on the community. Inside the courtroom, reactions were understandably emotional. Families carried years of grief into that moment. Years of waiting. Years of remembrance. Years of navigating a future forever altered by violence. A sentence could not restore what had been taken. But it marked the end of one chapter. The chapter focused on legal accountability. As proceedings concluded, many people reflected on the long journey from April 23, 2018, to the final outcome in court. The attack itself had lasted only minutes. The search for justice had taken years. Years filled with investigation, analysis, testimony, arguments, and ultimately, judgment. The court had reached its conclusion. Responsibility had been assigned. The legal system had spoken. Yet beyond the courtroom walls, another story continued. The story of recovery. The story of remembrance. The story of a city learning how to carry the memory of tragedy without allowing tragedy to define it. Because while the justice system had delivered its verdict, the emotional aftermath of the Toronto van attack would continue long after the final legal proceedings ended. And in many ways, that aftermath would become the most enduring part of the story. After the courtroom emptied and the final legal decisions were recorded, there was a silence that no judge could fill. It was not the silence of resolution. It was the silence that follows irreversible loss. The Toronto van attack had entered the record of history, documented in evidence files, legal transcripts, and official judgments. Yet for the people most affected, the story did not end with a verdict or a sentence. It continued in the quieter, more personal spaces where law has no jurisdiction. In kitchens where empty chairs remained. In phone contacts that would never ring again. In hospital rooms where recovery was slow and painful. In minds replaying moments that could not be changed. Time moved forward, but it did not move evenly for everyone. For the city, the attack gradually became part of its collective memory. Streets reopened. Traffic returned. New buildings rose. Daily life resumed its rhythm. Toronto, like all major cities, continued to evolve, refusing to remain frozen in a single moment of tragedy. But beneath that surface of normalcy, something more permanent had formed. A shared awareness that ordinary spaces could become sites of extraordinary violence without warning. A recognition that safety is not absolute, but conditional. A memory that cannot be fully erased. For the families of those who were killed, grief did not follow a schedule. It arrived in waves. Sometimes triggered by anniversaries. Sometimes by the sight of a similar street. Sometimes by nothing at all. Grief has its own logic. It does not ask permission to return. Some learned to carry it quietly, integrating loss into the fabric of daily life. Others found themselves changed in more visible ways, as if part of their identity had been permanently rewritten. There is no uniform way to survive the loss of a loved one in a sudden act of violence. There is only continuation. One day after another. For survivors who lived through the attack physically, recovery often proved complex. Injuries healed at different rates, but psychological wounds followed a less predictable path. Some found themselves avoiding crowded sidewalks. Others became hyper-aware of vehicles passing nearby. Ordinary sounds, once unnoticed, could suddenly trigger memories. A city street became something else entirely. A place of memory. A place of fear. A place of absence. Yet even within this lingering pain, life continued to move. Families celebrated milestones again, though sometimes with an empty space that could not be ignored. Children grew. Seasons changed. New routines formed around old losses. People learned, slowly and painfully, how to live with what could not be undone. Public memorials appeared in the days and months following the attack. Flowers, photographs, handwritten messages, and candles formed temporary landscapes of grief. Strangers who had never met the victims came to pay respects. Some stood in silence. Others left notes expressing sorrow, anger, or solidarity. These gestures did not change what had happened, but they acknowledged it. And acknowledgement matters in the aftermath of tragedy. Over time, discussions about the attack expanded beyond immediate grief into broader reflections on society. Questions emerged that had no simple answers. How do communities respond to acts of violence committed by individuals acting alone? How can warning signs, if they exist, be recognized earlier? What role does online radicalization play in shaping vulnerable minds? How can isolation in modern society be addressed before it deepens into something more dangerous? These questions did not belong only to Toronto. They resonated far beyond Canada. Because the themes present in this case were not unique. Loneliness, disconnection, online echo chambers, the search for identity in digital spaces. These are challenges shared across many countries in the modern world. Experts in psychology and criminology continued to study the case, not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. The goal was prevention, not explanation alone. Understanding why something happened is only the first step. The more difficult task is identifying how similar tragedies might be prevented in the future. Yet even experts were careful. There is a risk in focusing too heavily on a single case as a blueprint for all others. Human behavior is complex. Each individual path to violence, when it occurs, is shaped by a unique combination of personal, social, and psychological factors. Still, certain patterns were difficult to ignore. The role of isolation in increasing vulnerability. The amplification of resentment in online environments. The human need for belonging, even when it leads toward harmful spaces. These themes became part of broader conversations about digital culture and mental health. Meanwhile, within Toronto itself, life gradually settled into a new rhythm. Not a return to what it had been before, but an adaptation to what it had become. Communities continued to gather in remembrance. Anniversaries of the attack were marked with reflection and respect. Families of victims were often at the center of these commemorations, their presence serving as a reminder that behind every headline are real people whose lives were permanently changed. Some spoke publicly about their loved ones. Others chose privacy. Both responses were valid. Both reflected different ways of coping with unimaginable loss. There is no single correct way to remember. There is only the act of remembering itself. The legal system, having completed its role, receded into the background. The sentences had been issued. The appeals, if any, would proceed according to law. But justice in the legal sense is only one dimension of a much larger reality. There is also emotional justice, which is harder to define and impossible to fully deliver. There is social justice, which involves how communities respond. And there is personal justice, which each individual must interpret for themselves in the aftermath of loss. For some, closure came in understanding the facts of what happened. For others, closure remained distant or unattainable. Some found comfort in the certainty of the verdict. Others focused on preserving the memory of those who were lost rather than seeking emotional resolution. Over time, the story of the Toronto van attack became part of a broader historical record of urban violence in the modern era. It is studied not only as a criminal case but also as an example of how quickly everyday environments can be disrupted by deliberate acts of harm. But even as it entered academic discussions and policy debates, it never stopped being personal. For every statistic, there was a name. For every name, there was a life. For every life, there was a network of relationships that extended outward in countless directions. Parents, siblings, friends, co-workers, neighbors. Each connected to the victims in ways that cannot be fully captured in official reports. The legacy of the attack is therefore dual. On one level, it is a case study in investigation, prosecution, and sentencing. On another level, it is a collection of human stories marked by loss, resilience, and remembrance. Both perspectives are necessary. Neither is complete on its own. As years pass, the intensity of public attention naturally fades. News cycles move on. New events occupy headlines. Cities evolve. Yet for those directly affected, time does not erase significance. It reshapes it. The pain may soften, but it does not disappear. The memories may become quieter, but they remain present. And the absence left behind continues to influence daily life in subtle and enduring ways. The Toronto van attack stands as a reminder of how fragile ordinary life can be. A spring afternoon. A busy sidewalk. A city moving through routine. All of it transformed in minutes. It also stands as a reminder of human response in the face of tragedy. First responders who acted quickly. Strangers who helped strangers. Medical teams who worked under pressure. A police officer who made decisions that prevented further loss of life. Within the darkest moments, there were also acts of courage and compassion. Those actions do not erase what happened. But they matter. They form part of the complete story. And in the end, perhaps the most enduring truth is that while violence can disrupt a city, it cannot define it entirely. Toronto continues. Not unchanged. But continuing nonetheless. Carrying memory. Carrying grief. Carrying lessons. And carrying forward the lives of those who should never be reduced to the moment they were taken. The story of the Toronto van attack is ultimately not only about what was lost, but also about how people respond when confronted with loss that defies understanding. It is a story about a city forced to confront vulnerability. A legal system forced to confront intent. A society forced to confront the consequences of isolation and online radicalization. But above all, it is a story about human lives interrupted. And the enduring effort to remember them with dignity, even in the shadow of unimaginable violence. If there is one thing that remains after every true crime story is told, it is the uncomfortable realization that nothing about it truly feels final. Courtrooms deliver verdicts. Sentences are issued. Files are closed. Headlines fade. But human understanding never fully settles. The Toronto van attack is no exception. Even years after April 23, 2018, the event continues to exist in multiple forms at once. It exists as a legal case with defined outcomes. It exists as an academic study in criminology and psychology. It exists as a media reference point in discussions about urban safety and online radicalization. But most importantly, it exists as a collection of human memories that do not follow any official structure. For those who lived through it, there is no single narrative that fully contains what happened. There are only fragments. A moment of confusion on a busy sidewalk. A sound that did not belong to an ordinary afternoon. A sudden realization that something irreversible was unfolding in real time. And then, afterward, silence that felt heavier than noise. One of the most difficult aspects of understanding this case is accepting that it did not emerge from a single clear origin. There is no simple explanation that satisfies every question. No single factor that can be isolated as the cause. The investigation revealed layers rather than answers. Social isolation that deepened over years. Personal struggles that were never fully resolved. Online environments that amplified resentment instead of reducing it. A developing fixation on recognition and significance. And a final decision that transformed internal frustration into external violence. Each element alone is insufficient. Together, they formed a path that led to catastrophe. But even that explanation does not feel emotionally complete, because human behavior rarely fits neatly into structured models when examined through the lens of tragedy. People want clarity after violence. They want a point where the story becomes understandable enough to feel contained. Yet some events resist containment. They spill outward into broader questions about society, technology, and human connection. The Toronto van attack became one of those events. In the years that followed, discussions about the case expanded far beyond the courtroom. It became part of a global conversation about how modern life shapes vulnerable individuals. About how online spaces can both connect and isolate. About how loneliness, when left unaddressed, can evolve into something far more dangerous in rare but devastating cases. But even these broader discussions cannot overshadow the human reality at the center of the story. The victims were not abstract examples. They were individuals with lives that mattered long before they became part of a headline. They were people who experienced ordinary joys and ordinary struggles. People who were part of families, friendships, workplaces, and communities. People whose absence is still felt in ways that statistics can never capture. For their loved ones, the world after April 23 is fundamentally different. Not because everything stopped, but because something essential was removed. Life continued, but it continued with a permanent absence embedded within it. There are birthdays where someone is missing. Holidays where a seat remains empty. Ordinary days where memory appears unexpectedly, without invitation. Grief does not follow logic. It does not diminish simply because time passes. It becomes part of the structure of life itself. The same is true for survivors. Many carry invisible consequences that never appear in official reports. Trauma reshapes perception in subtle ways. A crowded street can feel different. A passing vehicle can draw attention it never once required. A moment of noise can trigger a memory that returns without warning. Healing, in this context, is not a destination. It is an ongoing process of adjustment. A negotiation between past and present. For investigators and legal professionals, the case represented something else. A challenge in understanding how intent forms within a human mind. How ideology can intersect with personal vulnerability. How digital spaces can influence perception of self and others. And how law must respond to actions that emerge from such complex intersections. The courtroom provided answers in the legal sense. Responsibility was assigned. Accountability was established. Sentencing concluded the formal process. But legal closure is not the same as emotional closure. The justice system can determine guilt. It can impose consequences. It can acknowledge harm. What it cannot do is restore what was lost. That responsibility belongs to time, memory, and the people who continue living with the aftermath. In reflecting on this case, it is important not to reduce it to a singular lesson. It is tempting to search for simple warnings that could prevent future tragedies. But human behavior does not offer such certainty. There are risk factors, patterns, and indicators that professionals study carefully. Yet there is no universal formula that predicts violence with precision. This uncertainty is part of what makes such events so unsettling. They challenge the assumption that the world is fully readable. That danger always announces itself clearly. That ordinary spaces are always safe by default. Instead, they reveal that unpredictability is part of human existence. Even so, there are lessons that emerge, though they are broader and more complex than simple prevention checklists. The importance of connection. The importance of recognizing isolation before it deepens. The importance of understanding how online environments shape perception. The importance of early intervention in cases of distress. And the importance of treating mental and emotional health as central, not secondary, to societal well-being. None of these lessons eliminate risk entirely. But they contribute to a society that is more aware, more attentive, and potentially more resilient. As time moves forward, the memory of the Toronto van attack will continue to shift. For some, it will remain a deeply personal wound. For others, it will become a historical reference point. For institutions, it will remain a case study. For the city itself, it will remain part of its identity, woven into the broader narrative of resilience that defines urban life. Because cities do not forget. They incorporate. They adapt. They carry memory forward in quiet ways. Street names do not change. Sidewalks remain in place. Buildings continue to rise. But beneath the surface, history accumulates. And people learn to live alongside it. Perhaps the most enduring truth of this case is that it contains both fragility and strength at the same time. Fragility in how quickly ordinary life was disrupted. Strength in how many people responded with courage, compassion, and care in the aftermath. Strangers helping strangers. First responders working under pressure. communities gathering to mourn and support one another. These responses do not undo the harm that was done, but they reflect something essential about human behavior in moments of crisis. Even in the presence of violence, there remains an instinct toward connection, toward protection, toward meaning. In the end, the Toronto van attack is not only a story about what was destroyed. It is also a story about what remains: memory, accountability, and the ongoing effort to understand how such events can arise within a modern city. There is no final resolution that fully satisfies every question raised by this tragedy. But there is continuity. The lives of those lost continue through the people who remember them. The lessons continue through those who study the case. And the city continues, carrying forward both grief and resilience in equal measure. And that, perhaps, is the only form of conclusion that such a story allows.